Well, it's been an interesting day in Manx politics. We've had two ministers on this morning at the briefing, and well, the main person being talked about was Mr. Cannan, who's with us now. Are you surprised with the conversations that we've been having with the ministers about you, and to some degree Brenda Cannell, but about you and your behaviour, as it's being put, with your position in charge of the Public Accounts Committee?
Well, possibly. I mean, I find it slightly surprising that you should be subjected to that level of attack when what you've been doing is questioning a government policy. So I guess I've touched a raw nerve. They felt that they've had to respond in such a manner. But the point is, I was challenging the government on their priorities primarily, and I was saying that the pension fund, the National Insurance Fund, was not their priority at the moment. Their priority should be the rebalancing. Their priority should be leading by example by addressing some of the core central expenditure issues, such as public sector pensions, such as the expense of the legislature, leading by example on that front, rebalancing the books, and then dealing alongside that with the National Insurance Fund. But it's to be conducting the business in the way they're conducting business, to me, seems a disproportionate sense of priorities, or getting their priorities wrong.
The main stance here is that you're head of this committee. Should you really be saying these sort of things when you're still taking evidence?
Well, first of all, these are my personal views and not the views of the Public Accounts Committee, of which I am chairman. Secondly, I don't believe I've said anything that interferes with the business of that committee. I merely said it remained to be seen whether the expenditure of £775,000 on consultants on this subject was justified. And the other point is, I find it very surprising government ministers calling for a backbencher's resignation. I didn't think people resigned in the Isle of Man government. You don't see ministers resigning over illegal loans. You don't see ministers resigning over failure to run their departments properly. So I find it surprising that you've got two government ministers asking a backbencher to resign from his position in a scrutiny committee merely because he's challenging the priorities in which they're conducting their business.
Well, I think, you say it's your personal views, but I presume it was the way it came across this morning, was that how can you be effective being impartial on this committee when you've made your views so well known now?
As I said, Paul, I merely questioned and stated that there was some explaining to do as to why the £775,000 was spent. And I was questioning the priorities of the government, and I was suggesting that the government, by carrying on the priority of the National Insurance Fund in the way that it was causing unnecessary alarm amongst pensioners. Now the facts are, from the last actuarial report that Tynwald had, were the actuaries, the UK government actuaries, clearly stated that fund would not run out until 2056. They clearly present a picture of the fund increasing in that period. They clearly state that a number of actions are being taken to help the situation, including raising the retirement age, and they clearly state that the next report will be due in 2015. So based on that evidence, I'm merely giving the Minister's advance warning that one of the questions that I will have as Chairman of the Public Accounts Committee is why the expenditure on a different set of consultants was necessary, given that we've got these facts laid out before us in the Government Actuaries Department's report.
Are you not causing a bit of panic by doing what you've done, though, causing stress and probably some concern amongst people with their pensions?
Well, this concern is building up and building up. My job is to question government policy where I see fit to, on behalf of my constituents. And in this case, I felt it was right and appropriate to perhaps focus some minds in government that there are other priorities, and that really the most important priority for government is to balance what you might call its current account, i.e. what it spends on a day-to-day basis servicing the infrastructure of the island. Now, we have a situation where the National Insurance Fund is provided for from people's salaries, is paid into by employed and self-employed people, and that fund is quite separate from the sort of core central government revenue expenditure on other items. It doesn't, for example, pay for roads. It doesn't, for example, pay for the majority of healthcare. What it does pay for is pensions and benefits, and therefore, the priority is to get ourselves back in balance. And this fund, according to the UK government actuary, is fine for a significant number of years yet.
Back to what was said, one of the media interviews, I think Chris Robertshaw used words, he's disgusted with your behaviour. I mean, that's quite very strong wording.
Well, I'm not about to lower myself into a slanging match with Chris Robertshaw. I mean, he's using very, very strong language. But, I've challenged the government policy on this. You expect to be challenged back, and quite rightly so. I think, clearly the Council of Ministers have felt so strongly about it that they want to use language like that. That's fine. I'm not about to start hurling in personal insults around the room.
Will you step down?
No, I haven't done anything or said anything when you analyse it that would in any way compromise my position. And I feel...
Well, they think you have.
Well, it's fine how on one hand, whenever you challenge the Council of Ministers, they appear to have done nothing wrong, and yet as soon as they get challenged on a perfectly reasonable, in a perfectly reasonable manner against a perfectly reasonable policy, you somehow find yourself the subject of personal abuse. And that's fine. For me, I just want to concentrate on the facts of the matter. I want to concentrate on what I believe are the right priorities for government. And I want to make sure that executive government is being held to account properly for its actions, and I believe I was justified in carrying out the statements that I've made.
Forgetting you, the chairman of this, I mean, you're a backbencher. These are people in coma, and they're kind of saying they're the ones that are doing it quietly, getting on with the job, and you're causing them problems because these sort of headlines is not doing them any help or favours. It
was quite interesting to hear Mr. Robertshaw sort of throw that allegation back that I hadn't done anything as chairman of the Public Sector Pensions Authority. Well, and then to say that he, in the last week or so, has got a group together to start looking at it. Well, that's actually fundamentally untrue and wrong, because Mr. Robertshaw hasn't done that. Tynwald did that via a motion that was brought forward by Howard Quayle in January, which I had the privilege of standing up to support, and I brought forward the likely areas of scrutiny that committee was likely to study, including capping pensions, including looking at career averages, looking at capping the salary levels that pensions should be considered at. And during my time as chairman of the Public Sector Pensions Authority, from its formation, which I was privileged to chair on behalf of the public and of course the workforce who are a stakeholder in that, I have sought to make sure that the full facts, the full extent of the problems with public sector pensions were brought out into the public domain. So I find it very surprising that despite the fact that it was Tynwald who told executive government to get on and sort out public sector pensions under a lot of pressure from the likes of Howard Quayle and myself, that Mr. Robertshaw wants to claim his glory for that. But of course, I guess he's gone into the position, so he will do.
I mean, any intimidation coming back? Because, the Friday briefing, the one subject was, and that's all we were told, these two ministers were going to discuss this again, which is quite unusual in itself. I mean, it seems you've touched some sort of raw nerve. Are you now going to back off?
Well, I'm not backing off anything, Paul. I've made my case. I've simply stated the facts as I see them in terms of where government's priorities lie. I've told you that I believe government didn't set out a clear plan at the beginning in terms of the rebalancing. I've told you that I feel strongly that government should have set much more of an example, both in looking at public sector pensions and the cost of the legislature. Instead, those two areas have been led predominantly by the backbenchers in both cases. It's Peter Carron who's having to bring forward a private member's bill about the Legislative Council and reforms there. But those types of costs and that cost bearing would have set the example for the public, and they would have had much more understanding when we as politicians start pontificating about how we're going to be potentially cutting pensions or removing the pension supplement. And that's probably where I felt the most strongly, was that we need to have a clear example from government. We need clear leadership. We clearly need to not only set an example, but communicate effectively with the public what their cost burden will be, both in terms of the rates and taxes, and also when you look at where these additional cost-cutting effects, if you like, or pension reductions are coming in.
finally, does this sort of bickering in public help Isle of Man PLC, or do you see where they were coming from, that they're getting on with it and you're a distraction for them?
Well, anybody who challenges the Council of Ministers policy is seen as a distraction for them. But my constituents and the people of the island don't always share the same views as the Council of Ministers. I don't share the same views necessarily as the Council of Ministers. Perfectly entitled to challenge the policy. I'm perfectly happy to have that challenged knocked back. Of course, I'm slightly surprised when it degenerates into sort of personal name calling, but I'm not really in that business, Paul. For me, it's about the policies. I'm really happy that we have proper policy debates. I'm happy that policies are challenged. Certainly, I would welcome that as a minister and the Council of Ministers, because it would be a great platform from which to state your case. So don't ask me to sort of go down to that sort of level about sort of personal criticisms of individuals and calls to resign, because clearly that example is not one that should be followed.
That's what I was going to finish with. I mean, you're not going to resign then?
No, unless my position actually is put in by Tynwald. Tynwald voted me in. If I believe that the majority of my Tynwald colleagues believe that I should step down and call on me to do so in Tynwald, then of course I will do that. And I'm quite willing to.
Well, you'd have to, wouldn't you? If they voted you.
Accept that. But as far as two ministers adopting this position that a backbencher should resign from a policy review committee merely because he's raised some questions about the way they're conducting their policies, to me is just not a resigning matter. And particularly, as I've said, we've had about at least two, if not three instances in this 2.5 years of this current administration where there's been very strong evidence to suggest that ministers should resign, and of course, we know the outcome of that. That just doesn't happen.